Has anybody ever said to you, that's really beneath your dignity, you should behave better, you should have the higher ground? Sometimes we say that to other people. Sometimes our great people even say it to Hashem. What is beneath a Jewish person's dignity? But let's have a look at the interaction between Yosef and his brothers after he accuses them of theft. In Pasuk, the Pasuk that says, Vayomer Elav Gomer, the brothers say to Yosef, God forbid, or Chalila Lecha, it's embarrassing that your servants, referring to themselves, would have stolen your goblet. So Rashi explains two ways that Chalila could be translated. One is Chulinhu. It's mundane, meaning to say it's something that is beneath our dignity. Lanu, for us. Leshoin Genai, it's almost like it's an undermining expression. And then it says, V'targum, the interpretation of how it's explained in Aramaic is, Chos la'avodecha, withhold that or stop that from your servants. Chos me'eis HaKadosh Baruch Hu yoleinu ma'aseh zois, that the Eibishter would, so to speak, interfere or stop us from behaving in this particular way. V'harba yesh b'gemara chas v'sholem, and he says that many times that kind of expression is used in the Gemara, like chas v'sholem, that the Eibishter should keep the negative away from us and give us peace. It's not the first time in Torah that we've seen this expression Chalila Lecha. Freer in Parashas Vayera, by the time of Avram and Eibishter. Remember when Avram Avinu in Parashas Vayera was negotiating with Hashem to save Sodom and Amorah? There he also said, "Ha'af tispet tzadikim rasha." Should the righteous be destroyed together with those who are wicked? There too, Avram Avinu uses the expression. He says, "Woe unto you, Hashem, to do such a thing." Rashi is and there Rashi also explains what Chalila Lecha means. Chulin hu lecha. It is beneath your dignity. It's mundane for you. People will say that's how you, the Eibishter, behave. You wipe everybody out indiscriminately, and that is inappropriate to say about Hashem. So Rashi has dealt with the word Chalila Lecha twice. We have to understand in that case two things. Aleph, number one, Favos in Parashas Vayera state the Lashon Chalila Tzemeshtem. How come the very first time the expression Chalila Lecha appears in Parashas Vayera, and Rashi usually deals with an issue the first time it appears, is Rashi mistaping mit Noptaichen Chulin Olach. There Rashi is happy to say Chalila Lecha means it is beneath your dignity, Hashem, so to speak. Whereas in unser Parasha, whereas in our Parasha, where it's Yosef's brothers addressing him, Rashi is dissatisfied to just simply say it's beneath us. And there is Mosef L'Shin Genai, and he adds it is a disparaging expression. If that expression chulin needed to be explained, then Rashi should have done what he normally does, which is to explain it the first time it appears back in Parashas Vayera. Second question, Bei is Nachmer. Rashi is donit no moisif tever l'shen genai. Not only does Rashi clarify that Chalila Lecha means that it is disparaging, now he also offers a second possible interpretation, based on the explanation or the translation in Aramaic. Favos is in Parashat Vayera genug the Pirush Chulinu Lecha. How come when Avram Avinu is speaking to Hashem Chulinu that it's mundane or beneath your dignity is good enough as an explanation? On do is just nit masbek and davon kommt zu zweite Pirush. Whereas over here suddenly it's not good enough and we need a second explanation as well. Why? So the Rebbe is going to tell us immediately what the difference is. There's a significant difference between Yosef and his brothers. Yosef's brothers speaking to him versus Avram Avinu speaking to Hashem. The beer in them explanation is this: in Parashas Vayera is the lashon Chalila gizakti v'oren klapen the Meibishten. Well, Avram Avinu, when he says Chalila Lecha, is addressing Hashem. Was bei ihm ist klar nicht scheich von Chulin v'choil. In Hashem's reality, there's no such thing as things which are mundane, which are ordinary. Is der Rebbe genug zu sagen, as says Kadavar as tmias, and therefore when Avram Avinu raises this big, astonishing question, are you going to do this? Are you going to wipe everybody out? It is Val Chulin hu lecha. That's enough to say to the Rebbe, it is a mundane activity. It's how people behave, not how God behaves. As das is by the Eibishter in ganzen abgefragt, and that would be good enough reason to say for the Eibishter that such conduct, such a decision is completely unexpected and not the way that the Eibishter should behave. In unser Parasha, but in our Parasha, we're not talking about God. We're talking about humans who do also do mundane things, even Yosef's brothers. Ordinary activities. If you argue that a particular behavior is a mundane behavior, that's not a good enough reason to say, and therefore a human shouldn't do it, because that's what humans do. In this case, taking the silver goblet. It's not good enough to say that's an ordinary behavior. You've got to say that's a terrible behavior. What would be the great shock and horror if a human being did something which was ordinary behavior? You've got to say it's more than ordinary behavior. It is horrible behavior. Therefore, Rashi here has to clarify what's bad about the accusation of Yosef is not just that he's asking or he's accusing them of doing something which is ordinary, he's accusing them of doing something which is disparaging. How dare you accuse us of behaving in such a way? Here, Rashi is showing us that the word chulin doesn't just mean ordinariness. Rather, here the expression chulin is something which is disgusting, and therefore, out of the question, we're decent humans. We don't do these kinds of things. Clear and easy distinction. But the Pirish is niklatik, but that explanation on its own is not good enough. When would it make sense to say that mundane behavior is actually disparaging? Well, if you were talking about somebody who is so dignified or so elevated or so spiritual that to say they're dirtying their hands with ordinary activities would be an insult, then it will make sense, okay? If you say something is mundane, it's a negative expression. In that circumstance, with such an elevated, special, dignified person, to call something mundane would be a slap in the face. Yeah, then taka, if a person whose life is dedicated to higher ideals is now being accused of being involved in ordinary things, that would be an insult. In fact, if you're dealing with somebody who is all spiritual or all dignified and you're saying you're doing such ordinary, mundane things, that actually would be a very serious insult. Because if you're talking about something which doesn't suit that person's elevated status, then it should be so out of the question. Well, if the whole attitude or the whole definition of this person is that this is a very elevated, dignified person, and now you're accusing them of doing ordinary things, that in itself is in a sense worse than saying they're a ganef. But is that the context of Yosef's brothers over here? Really, what Yosef's brothers needed to prove over here is they are not Ganovim. They did not steal the silver goblet. It's a bit weird that they would try to defend the fact that they are honest people who haven't stolen by saying that would be mundane activity for us. Das ist Tali Tanya, Bidelo Tanya. You're effectively using, as the Gemara uses the expression, you're trying to explain something based on something that hasn't yet been explained. In other words, Yosef, assuming he is the viceroy of Egypt, doesn't know their status. So, it's beneath our dignity. I don't know, who are you? What is your dignity? As Geneva is by mufrech, vala filchulin is by adava meguna. To use the argument that, well, we surely are not thieves because if you know us, you'll know that we don't even engage in mundane things. Well, he officially doesn't know them. Besides the fact that they're not even speaking directly at this point to Yosef himself, they're speaking to his non-Jewish representative who's come to arrest them. Who happens not just to be an ordinary non-Jewish person, but an Egyptian, Erev Asa'aretz, who belongs to the most depraved society at the time, who tell this person that we don't engage in mundane activities. So look at you like you're crazy. What's wrong with that? Everybody engages in mundane activities. They should have just said clearly, we're not Ganovim. So really, the logic is that if the brothers wanted to prove that they would never have touched something that didn't belong to them, they should have done so. They shouldn't have used riddles and said, oh no, that's mundane for us. They should have just said, that is a crime, we're not criminals. So because that's not a full explanation, therefore Rashi has to bring a second interpretation, because this argument on its own, although it works in Parshas Vayera beautifully, over here leaves something unanswered, and therefore Rashi gives a second explanation that it means chos. Prevent us, please. Keep that away from us. May it never be, so to speak, in front of Hashem that we behave such a way. There, that fits perfectly with the argument that they're trying to make to the Egyptians. God forbid that we should actually steal. Und noch mehr, der Eberstaat hat für uns Achmanos und der lässt nicht, dass wir sollen viel beschenken, nicht so werden als Sach. In fact, they're not only saying, God forbid should we steal, they're saying that the Eberstaat should prevent us, may Hashem protect us from even doing accidental theft. In other words, maybe it slipped into somebody's bag and we don't know about it. May the Eberstaat protect us even from that. It's a very strong argument, a lot stronger than saying it is mundane or beneath our dignity. So why doesn't Rashi put that as the first explanation? Because it's not typical in Tanakh that the word Chalila actually means Chas, may Hashem protect us. Therefore Rashi has to tell us, well, look in the Gemara and you will actually see this expression. And the Rabbi brings a session not else Sveit and Pirish, and that's also why Rashi has to leave this to the second explanation, because it is not so close to the pshat of the word Chalila in Torah. On the Pirish Vayikris as Chalila meant Chulin Hulanu, and he has to say that the very first way to try and explain the word Chalila is from the word Chulin, because that makes more sense in the context of Tanakh. So now we get it. We understand the difference between Parashas Vayera, where obviously it is an insult to suggest that Hashem engages in the behavior of mundane people, whereas with Yosef and the brothers, it has to be a little bit more than that, and that's why he needs two explanations as well. And he has to say Chalila L'cha in its own right, or actually means Lashon Ganai, that it's an insult. So what can we learn from this? The Hayrof and the Pirshash and Avedis Hashem, the lesson is we have to know what is beneath our dignity as Jewish people. The Alter Rebbe is Mevor in Torah Oyer. So the Alter Rebbe tells us in Torah Oyer that we have to learn something from every story of the Avos, but not from every detail of the stories of the Shvatim. As B'chinas Avos, Tzarich Liyas B'chol Adam, the elements of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov have to play out in all of our lives. But the other more specific stories that are told in the Torah, like for example the stories of the Shvatim, it's quite possible that a person won't have any of those elements reflected in their life. So they're not necessarily as encompassing or generic stories. In other words, the pshat davon. Nicht jeder Eid muss haben in sich die alle Beginnes und in Jahren Muychodim, was damit hat sich ein Shevet ausgeteilt von die andere. It's not necessary for every one of us in our spiritual journey to experience those things that were unique to one of the Shvatim as opposed to the others. However, if there's something that impacted all of the Shvatim, likelihood is it does have a lesson for us. Aber die Beginnes von Jahren Klolim was einen gewinn bei alle Shvatim, if there's something more generic that impacted all of the Shvatim, als Bonim von the Avos, who obviously are the children and heirs to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, those are things that must affect us. This is a story of something that touched all of the Shvatim, so it must have a lesson for us. And the fact that all of the brothers together, all of the Shvatim together say that is mundane behavior and therefore an insult to us, is not coming from our Shevet Prati. That wasn't something relative to a specific Shevet. Now from the Shvatim B'chlolusim, was something that affected all of the brothers, i.e. all of the Shvatim. Is moving as Daniel from Chulin Hulanu is in Negia Yed Eden. So therefore that principle that something is mundane and beneath our dignity has a lesson for each of us as a Jewish person. What is that? The Jew has to know Chulin and Jews don't go together. We have to know that our very essence and our whole being as Jewish people has to be holy. The Jew and the mundane physical world are actually worlds apart. Therefore, for a Jewish person to engage in the physical world in the ordinary manner that other people do is actually an insult. It should be something that is completely off the table. A Jew does not engage the physical world purely physically. And that consciousness that we don't engage the world in an ordinary way, but rather in a holy way, shouldn't just be something we have deep down inside of our neshamas as an awareness. Like in the story over here, where the brothers were speaking to a non-Jewish Egyptian man saying, this is who we are. Our awareness that we don't belong in the physical mundane world as physical mundane people should be something which is so obvious and so clear that even the non-Jewish world sees that when they look at us. As by the Shvatim is given bepashtas, as the Taina von Chulin Hulana Alene is genug Gechacha for Mitzrayim. Look at the Shvatim; they were convinced that for them to say we don't engage in ordinary mundane activity was compelling enough for a non-Jewish Egyptian, as by says that the non-Jew would recognize. You're right. Jewish people do not engage the physical world as a physical world. That says that means that our experience of knowing how holy we are and that the mundanities of this world are off the charts for us should be so much part of our lives that it is completely obvious to other people out there, the non-Jewish world. They look at us and they should see that about us. Und Agam, as Torah sagt, on Eden, Shesh Yom Taved, was ist gekommen lachtecha, you will ask, but the Torah says we have to engage the world. 6 days we have to work within the world. As Eid Bechel, soll sich vernehmen mit Chulin, which means that during the days of the week, the time that we engage the world, we actually have to engage the world, we actually have to earn money and eat food, etc. Is nicht die Kavanah in dem, as soll sich herablassen zu die Chulin. Well, we got to be clear. That is not the Torah giving us license to engage ourselves in the mundane world. Neither, but to the contrary. It's actually an imperative for us that we have to master the world and elevate the world as the halacha says. You take something which is chulin ordinary and you tackle and deal with it in a way that would be considered holy. That's what Jewish people are supposed to do. The way that we achieve that is by directing all of our activities to higher purpose and being aware and conscious of Hashem in every single thing that we do. Until eventually we actually sanctify all of the ordinary mundane things of this world, and we elevate them to a sense of ordinary or entry level holy, and then eventually to absolute holiness. That's what a Jew is. So do we engage the world? Yes. Do we engage the world in the way of the world? No. How do we engage the world? Mastery, to transform and elevate the world. Now, how does a Jew reach such an evolved level? As I feel is which means that a Jew who's following the instructions of Torah to engage the world and yet simultaneously remaining completely aloof from the world, not only aloof from the world, but looking at engagement in the world as an insulting, degrading state to be in. How do I get the ability to do this? Where do I find this strength? It's because we're plugged into the Eibishter, and the Eibishter engages the world while remaining aloof from the world. Which means the kind of divine energy that is relative to and therefore gives life to the world is never held within the world. And it's not possible that the normal activity of godliness running the world should become mundane, even though it is the godliness to run the world. Look at how Avraham Avinu speaks to the Eibishter. He doubles the expression. It would be mundane or degrading for you to behave in this way. It would be degrading or mundane for you to not to do justice in the world. Let's even assume somebody can make the radical comment, Eibishter, are you going to do something which does not follow justice? Well, that would be enough reason to say to the Eibishter, how can you kill good people together with bad people? So why does Avraham Avinu add to that and say, is it right, the judge of all of the earth, not to do justice? He's already made his point. Tzaddik in Russia is bad enough. Now, the mitzvah Avraham Madgish given because Avraham Avinu wanted to emphasize something else. As I feel in the Daga von Hashefet Kol Haaretz, Avraham Avinu is saying, yes, Eibishter, we know that you play a role of judge of earth, which means you engage the world at its level relative to its needs. The Daga von Irkus von Meisat Tachtenim Zanin Tefus Mokem, a perspective of godliness by which the elements and creations of this world are valuable. They actually have a role to play. They deserve to be judged by you, and therefore you will reward their behavior when right, and you will give them consequences when they behave wrongly. Avraham Avinu is emphasizing, even when the Eibishter engages the world, he's not, so to speak, within the realm of the world. So therefore the ordinary experiences of this world are an insult to Hashem if he were to, so to speak, follow them. Und der Rebbe ist es bei Eden, was and seeing as even the part of Eibishter, the energy of Hashem that runs our world, has to remain aloof from the world, cannot be captured by and defined by the realities of the world. We have at the core of our being that is a piece of Hashem, and therefore we have that same aloofness. As I feel even at the time where we are engaged with the world in the mundane things of the world, we don't allow it to envelop us, to catch us. In our truest self, even while we engage the world, we remain aloof from the world. In fact, we are so aloof from the world that the mundanity of the world is insulting to us. We don't want to go there, we don't want to be associated with it. Und aus Guf ist der Time, was Said hat dem Kersibe machen die Chulin bis as they sollen sein Chulin Shanas Altar as Hakedesh. That's what allows us the opportunity to master the world and to transform the mundane things of this world to become holy things. Why? Because we're not sucked into the world, we stand above the world, therefore we can influence and transform the world. The reason being because the truest self of who I am is somebody who is beyond the things of mundane life, therefore we're not defined by them. So that lesson speaks to the broader message of our parasha, the parasha which essentially introduces the process that would lead to the Egyptian exile and of course the Geula that would follow. Und welcher setzt sich wegen dem Ketz und die letzte Sibes und Moros, welcher haben der führt zu die Befehl von Yaakov und Vonav Mitzrayim. This is Mikeitz. This is the parasha that tells us the catalyst that brought the Jews into Egypt, which eventually became the Egyptian exile. Und in dem Golus Mitzrayim was this Rosh L'chol Agolios, which is the precursor and the, so to speak, ancestor of every kind of Golus that exists. We well know as Chassidim what the Rabbeim said about Golus, that it only affects us superficially. As nur unsere Gufim seine gegeben in Golus v'shibud Malchus, only our bodies were handed over to the forces of Golus. Aber unsere Neshamas hat man in Golus nicht vertrieben, but our Neshamas were never dragged into Golus, und in Shibud Malchus nicht gegeben, and were never entrusted into the subjugation of those who took us into Golus. So how could Golus impact a Jewish person? Only when sein Guf und Yonam Gashma haben bei Matfisis Mokem. Well, the only Jew who is susceptible to Golus, who Golus can harm, is the Jew who is invested in the material, mundane things of this world, the physicality of this world. But when a Jew stands on the pedestal that he should stand on, which is to look at the world and say, mundane things, that is an insult. I don't go, that's not me. Because what I experience is the light of my own neshama. That's real for me. And the essence and light of my neshama is completely detached from anything of the mundane world. Well, if my reality is determined by my neshama was never in Golus, the Golus doesn't truly impact me. Das ist echt der Tam Pnimi, was die letzte Passierung, was hat Gerim gewinnt zu Yaakov Vonav Mitzrayim is given. And that's actually why what was the final story that got Yaakov and his family into Mitzrayim and eventually into the Golus is given. Das, was man hat bei den Schwatten gefunden in dem Gewehr HaKesef. It's because of the trumped up charge of theft where they found the silver goblet in Binyamin's bag. Warum Golus und Shibud Malchus können nicht Chelek seine Frieden sein, wenn sie es bei Dol Cholapochus Epes Achsonen dem Hegesh von Chulin L'Shein Genai. The Rebbe is going to give us a fascinating reason why this is. The only time that Golus could touch a person is if the person has an experience, even if it's in a very light, very subtle way of acknowledging or being susceptible to the things of this world. The world is not completely insulting to me. Listen to what that means. Das was sie sind nicht schon geworden zu haben bei sich dem Gewehr Kesef. The fact that they actually landed up having the silver goblet in their possession without them even knowing about it, how could such a thing happen? Nothing is by chance. It could only happen that this was the method Yosef was able to successfully use against them because they were not 100% divorced from the mundanity of this world. As the axiom goes, that if we were to look from the perspective of a person's neshama, they would be unable to do something against what Hashem wants, even accidentally. The fact that a person is exposed and susceptible to doing something accidentally wrong indicates that they're not as aloof and protected from this world as they should be. So therefore, the fact that there could be a theft, not of their doing and not of their choice, is an indicator that they were not as divorced from Gashmis as they should have been. So Kashemi das when get Saiden, as a Ganzina Golus is not bechitzenis mitzad aguf, aber bipnimis mitzad neshama is in a massive mechirus of Geula. So now that we understand that this is the positioning statement of a Jewish person, Golus is superficial to us. It can only affect the superficial parts of who we are, our physical self, whereas the truest self is always in a state of Geula. That gives us an insight into how the Golus itself works. In other words, Golus is not as real as it appears. The Kavanah was the Eibishter schickt in Golus. Why did Hashem create Golus and send Jews into that state? Only to prepare us for the inevitable greatness and elevation that would come as a result of Golus. In other words, the Geula that would follow. So the goal is not the Golus and suffering, it is only the Geula that follows. Which means that our descent into Golus is a superficial experience, not the real story of what's going on over here. What is really going on over here? What does Hashem really intend? The greatness, the rebound, the elevation that will follow because of the Golus. And that gives us an insight into the really well-known Gemara about the fact that Mashiach is born as the Golus begins. As the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, so the Redeemer is born. He would have to be a very old man by now. What does it mean? Das heißt, the message really is that as soon as Golus begins, Geula begins. Because the Golus is not a means, it is not an end in itself. The Golus is only a part of a process, the goal of which is Geula. So the minute Golus begins, it has to be that Geula is beginning, because that is the only value and purpose of Golus. And that's part of what we have to do as Jewish people, is to create this consciousness and awareness. When we successfully serve the Eibishter in such a way that you can feel who we are on the inside, that we really are neshamas. The neshama was is hechafun zu sein in Golus, and our reality is our neshama, which is obviously beyond the constraints of the Golus. So as we succeed in doing that, illustrating that we are all about neshama, and that is our truth, that also automatically illustrates that the Golus is not about Golus. Then gilui fun de Geula, but the Golus is there for the purpose of Geula. Now, Rashi has illustrated such an incredible point to us, and the Rabbi often says that Rashi teaches things on multiple layers and alludes to things, even things that are at deeper levels of how we interpret Torah. Rashi is typically about Pshat, but he also alludes to things at the levels of Remez and Soid. So gefindt men euch Remez if dem in Golus ve'Geula now in Perish Rashi besim fun unser parasha. We're going to see the same kind of allusion, that hint. That's something that Rashi is going to point out. It's actually quite a diktuk, grammatical thing that Rashi points out with a deep message towards the end of the parasha. If diverto manit stadox at the end of the parasha, what do the brothers say? How can we justify ourselves? There's obviously a libel against us, and we can't defend it. So Rashi takes that word nitzadok and mefarish. It says as follows: L'shoin tzedek. The root of that word is tzedek, justice. And then he explains grammatically. If you have a word where the core root of the word starts with the letter tzaddik, and it is then presented in an expression of reflective, passive, in other words, something impacts something else. Now, in Tesbim came Tov, you stick in a tes into that word, and it comes after the first letter of the root of the word. So the word tzedek gets a tes, it's slapped in between it, and now instead of the word being nitzadak, it's nitztadak. Rashi gives various examples, and then he says, if you have a word where the core word, the root is a letter, it starts with the letter sin, with the letter samach or the letter shin or sin. There also it's put into this form of this reflective passive state. Then you get a tof that gets stuck in between the letters. And there also he brings examples, and we're going to look at those examples. First, he gives examples of words that start with a samach, soval, sochal. And then words that start with a shin, it gives a shamar shaylil. So that makes sense because samach is earlier in the aleph base. So you first give those examples. But then on his Messiah, after giving both sets of examples, Rashi concludes with an example that goes back to a samach, mistoylel be'ami, where Moshe Rabbeinu says to Paroi, you are still delaying or playing games with my people. Migizas derech loy sulula, says Rashi. That word mistoylel is from the original root of the same word that means a path that hasn't been completely cleared or paved or made easy to pass through. Davon verstehen, we have to ask three questions. Aleph, first of all, it didn't say it in Pirush Rashi. If you follow the logical order of how Rashi is explaining things, first he starts off with letters, with words where the root word starts with a samech. And then he moves to words that start with a root that has a shin at the beginning. He should have used the example of mistalel, which is a word where the root starts with a samech. He should have put it in the same list of other words he was using that start with a samech. And logically, he should have first tackled this word with a samech before he got onto the other words with a shin. Question 1. Question 2, base. Why does Rashi say that word mistalel comes from this root, a path that is not cleared or paved? Go have a look in Parashas Va'era, and how does Rashi explain there the word mistalel? As mistalel is megizras mesila. There he explains that it is from the word mesila, which is a path, not the nature of the path, the clarity of the path, the paved nature of the path. Why does he change his opinion here? And lastly, Gimel Favos Dr. Rashi megizas derech loy selula nipikitz megizas selula. Why does Rashi have to give us words that are apparently not relevant to understanding the grammar? He could have just said it comes from the word selula. Why does he have to say derech loy selula, a path that hasn't been properly cleared or paved? Aderech ve'ezakn pashas ve'er megizas mesila. So is the Pirin Dem Aderech Haremesh B'Pirush Rashi. This is a great example of where Rashi delves into the deeper understanding of Torah here, Remez, and he's telling us this. The chiluk between unser Parasha and Parashas Va'era is there's a massive difference between our Parasha and Va'era. It's two ends of the same story. Parashas Mikeitz red kanal wegen dem Ketz von Zman Achana zu Golus Mitzrayim. Parashas Mikeitz is all about the catalyst for the beginning of the Golus in Egypt. Dagegen in Parashas Va'era redt sich wegen der ersten Makkes, was der Bescheid gebracht hat in Mitzrayim, whereas Parashas Va'era is the beginning of the story of Geula, Haschalas HaGeula, because it's the beginning of the plagues. Aber Frata Pi Maimer Azal, as noch Rosh Hashanah, Batla Avodim Aviseinu b'Mitzrayim, especially when you consider the Gemara tells us that already from Rosh Hashanah, people were no longer working as slaves in Egypt. So in Parashas Va'era, we're already at the end of the Golus. So Mikeitz is the beginning of the Golus, and Va'era is the beginning of the Geula. And their meat is moving was in Parashas Va'era by the Aschalas HaGeula. So therefore, when Rashi is talking Parashas Va'era, the beginning and unfolding of the Geula, Sagt Rashi as Mistalel as Megizras Mesila. It makes sense. The word Mistalel should be associated with a path because the path is being forged. Hagamas Paro is Mistalel b'Ami Levilti Shalcham, despite the fact that Paro is playing delay tactics over here and he doesn't want to let the Jewish people go. Doesn't matter. Is das Norval hot nit the head Asishein Aschalas HaGeula? That's because Paro is stuck and he is completely dead to the idea that the Geula has begun. But what's really happening over here? The path has been opened. There is already a clear road to follow to Geula. Paro is just a stick in the mud. In fact, the very behavior of Paro to delay the Exodus is given by Hashem says that's because I want to publicize the miracles much more, so let Paro push back so we can do greater miracles and we could do more miracles. So therefore in Parashas Va'era, Rashi is going to see in the word Mistolel the path to Geula. Mashenkin in unser Parasha, yet the same word when Rashi is looking through the lens of our Parasha, where the technique is Aschalas HaGolus, where the theme of our Parasha is the beginning of the problems, the beginning of the Golus, is the Mistel B'Amin and Eifim Fun Derech Lo Yiselula. Well, then at this point we're looking at a path that is not clear and there's nowhere to go. It's looking like Golus. We're not seeing our way clear. Yet, here's an important point. Rashi is giving us two different interpretations of what? Seinen Eufen selben Wort. It's two interpretations of the same word. What word? Mistolel. Rashi would never give us two different explanations on the same word unless those two explanations actually link with each other and kind of add value to each other. What Rashi is telling us is even the beginning of Golus where the path appears not to be clear. Is that derech, it's still a path. Derech mesil was führt zu de Geula. It's a path to Geula, you just don't see it yet. It's just not a clear path yet. That's because we don't know the direction. But the Eibusha sees the path. It's not a clearly trodden path because outwardly this still looks like Golus. But what is it really? Is it derech von loy selula? Golos gufas in from Masila l'shara. It may not look like it, but Golos is a path to Geula. And Masila to the Geula valdi kavon and pnimus from Golos mitzayim yitzias mitzrayim u'matan Torah. Because anybody who really knows what's going on understands that Golos is the path to Geula and by extension to receive the Torah. If we can't see it yet, that's because it's a premature state for us. It's not because it's not true. On the Rebbe bringt Rashi the dugma from Mistedel be'ami, and that's why Rashi quotes this example of how the samach gets interrupted by a tuf, and he uses the word Mistedel. Where does he bring it? Was steht bei dem Makas mit welcher hat sich angeheben die Geula Kanal. He's quoting now something related to Geula. In unser Parasha, wo sich noch wegen der Achana v'aschalas hagolos, Rashi wants to incorporate that in his interpretation of our Parasha, which is describing the beginning of Golos. He wants us to already know where we're going. Because we need to know that right at the beginning, tough and dark as it may appear, the goal is there, the path is there. Geula is the objective. Is Rashi stellt die Dugma von Mistel zum Seif von seinem Pirish, which also explains why Rashi does not use this example of Mistel in the logical sequence of where you think it would belong, but he puts it right at the end of all his commentary. Mit dem ist meramas as der Abschluss und Tachlis von dem Moros, was während erzählt in die Parashas von Vayeshev und Mikeitz. He's hinting at the fact that what will be the conclusion and the objective of all the things we are currently reading about in these Parashas, Vayeshev Mikeitz. We're reading about the Golos. We need to know it's all towards an end game. Mistoidel, at the end it's going to be Geula. And that end game is already manifest. Now we just don't see it. On Hazoi, as I say, when I get some Golos, the same principle applies to where we are now waiting for Mashiach. As when I the heard as the ganze Inyan from Golos is not a chitzenes dike Inyan. As soon as a Jewish person really gets to appreciate that Golos is superficial, it's not real. Aber bei Prima steht der Herr von Golos und sich schön da der Innen Deliosid. And so the truth of who I am is, I'm beyond Golos. I'm already plugged into the future. Das Gufa bringt Aris die Primus von dem Golos min Ahelem el Agiloi. That realization and that consciousness and the behavior that goes with it will already get us from Golos to Geula. Or more correctly, to reveal the detail, the truth of what Golos is all about. And that brings and manifests the Geula with Mashiach, and it should happen immediately.